Dorothy Wade hit the platform at Ridgeline so hard her knees split open on the wood planks. She didn't get up right away. She just knelt there in the Kansas dust, both hands pressed flat against the ground. A photograph of a little boy crushed against her palm. His face, his smile. The last picture she had before Leonard took him too. When a man crouched down beside her and said nothing, just offered his hand. She looked up with eyes that had stopped asking the world for mercy a long time ago. If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to this channel. Follow Dorothy and Nate all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The stage from St. Louis had been running 11 hours late by the time it rolled into Ridgeline, Kansas, trailing a cloud of alkaline dust that coated everything it touched and settled into the back of your throat like chalk. It was the kind of dust that made a person feel like the land itself was trying to swallow them. Nathaniel Calhoun had been standing outside the relay station since 2 in the afternoon. It was now pushing 7, and the light had gone from gold to copper to a thin bruised purple that told him the sun was giving up on the day entirely. He hadn't expected to feel nervous. He was 41 years old. He'd walked through cannon fire at Chickamauga. He'd buried his father with one hand and signed foreclosure papers with the other without making a sound. Nervous was not something Nathaniel Calhoun did. And yet here he stood, hat in both hands, working the brim in a slow circle the way he always did when he was trying not to let something show. "You're gonna ruin that hat." Pete Aldridge, who ran the relay station and talked more than any man Nate had ever met, leaned out the doorway with his arms crossed. "Ain't gonna make the stage come faster neither." "Didn't ask your opinion, Pete. Offering it free of charge." Pete squinted down the road. "She know what she's coming to." A cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. One man, no neighbors for 3 miles. "She knows." "And she still answered the ad?" Nate didn't respond to that. He'd asked himself the same question about 40 times in the 4 months since Miss Dorothy Wade of St. Louis had replied to his advertisement in the Western Bride Gazette. Her letter had been 3 paragraphs. No photograph. No flowery language. She could keep accounts, she said, having worked as a schoolteacher for 6 years. She could manage a household. She was experienced with livestock from childhood on a farm outside Springfield. She asked for one thing in return: a legal marriage, a permanent address in Kansas territory, and a man who would not lie to her. That last part had stopped him cold. Not the request itself. The way she'd phrased it: not a man who was kind, not a man who was gentle. A man who would not lie. That was a woman who had already been lied to in ways that mattered. He'd written back the next morning. The stage appeared at the south bend of the road, horses blowing hard, the driver hauling back on the reins before the rig had even fully slowed. It was a hard stop, too hard, and Nate stepped forward instinctively. The door swung open. 3 passengers climbed down. A drummer with 2 sample cases, an older man in a minister's collar, and then a woman who stepped off the footrest and walked exactly 4 steps before her legs stopped working. She didn't cry out. She didn't grab the railing. She simply went down the way a person goes down when they've been holding themselves upright through sheer will for so long that the moment the destination arrives, the body simply decides it's done. Her knees hit the planking hard enough that Nate heard it from 10 feet away. Both hands slapped flat against the platform. She stayed there. The drummer stepped around her without looking down. The minister hesitated, then moved on. Nate crossed the distance in 4 strides and crouched beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak right away. He just got down to her level, which was something his mother had told him once: never stand over someone who's fallen and ask if they're all right. Get down and wait. She had dark hair, most of it escaped from its pins after 11 hours in a coach. Her dress was gray wool, good quality, once now travel worn down to the threads. She was gripping something in her right hand so hard, her knuckles had gone white, and when she finally looked up, Nate saw her eyes. Gray. Sharp as a February morning. And somewhere behind the exhaustion and the set of her jaw, fury. Not the hot kind. The cold kind. the kind that had been burning a long time. "Miss Wade," he said. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they haven't decided whether to trust yet. "Mr. Calhoun." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm not weak," she said. "I need you to know that before anything else." "Didn't think you were." "My legs just—" She pressed her lips together. "The ride was long." 11 hours. That'd take anyone's legs." He offered his hand. "Can you stand?" She looked at the hand for a half-second, then took it. He helped her to her feet slowly, and she let him, but the moment she was upright, she stepped back, putting distance between them with a precision that told him it was an old habit. She tucked the thing she'd been holding. He could see now it was a photograph into the bodice of her dress. "There's a bag," she said. "Just one. They may have lost it." "I'll check." Pete was already dragging a single worn carpet bag off the back of the coach. He set it down and looked at Dorothy with the openly curious expression of a man who had decided social grace was optional. "This all you brought from St. Louis?" "This is all I have," Dorothy said. She didn't flinch when she said it. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Pete opened his mouth. Nate looked at him. Pete closed his mouth. Nate picked up the bag. "There's a restaurant at the end of the block. Helen Cross runs it. Best food in Ridgeline, which ain't saying much, but it's hot and there's a lot of it. You should eat before we ride out." "How far is the ranch?" 6 miles. "I can ride 6 miles without eating." "I know you can." He started walking. "I haven't eaten since noon and I'd like to, so you're welcome to sit with me or wait outside." A pause behind him. Then the sound of her footsteps following. Helen Cross's restaurant was called simply the Cross Table, which Helen said was either a reference to her last name or to her general disposition, depending on the day. She was 55, broad across the shoulders, with iron gray hair and hands that had been working since before most people in Ridgeline were born. She'd been a field nurse at Shiloh. She'd buried a husband and 2 sons to fever and kept the restaurant open through all of it because, as she said, people still needed to eat, regardless of what the world was doing. She took one look at Dorothy Wade standing in her doorway and put down the pot she was holding. "Sit," she said. Not unkindly, just the way Helen said most things, which was directly and without decoration. Dorothy sat at the corner table. Nate noticed she chose the seat with her back to the wall and both doors in her sight line. He'd seen soldiers sit that way. Helen brought stew, cornbread, and coffee before either of them had asked. She set everything down in front of Dorothy first. "Eat slow," she said. "Your stomach's been empty a while." Dorothy looked at her. "How do you know?" "You've got that look." Helen tapped her own jaw. "Hollow here. I've seen it before." She said nothing else and went back to her kitchen. Dorothy picked up the spoon. She ate carefully, not the way hungry people usually eat, not fast, not desperate. Deliberately, like someone practicing the action of being a person who was allowed to sit at a table and eat a meal. Nate watched her without seeming to. He'd gotten good at that over the years, watching people without letting them know they were being watched. "The advertisement," Dorothy said without looking up. "You wrote that you were looking for a working partner, not a romantic arrangement." "That's right." "You meant it." "I meant every word I wrote." She looked up then. "Most men who place those ads mean something different." "I know they do." He broke a piece of cornbread. "I ain't most men." "That's what most men say." "Yes, ma'am. And most of the time they're wrong." He met her eyes. "I reckon the only way to prove the difference is time. I don't expect you to take my word for it." She studied him the way she'd studied his hand back at the platform, measuring, calculating odds. "Your letter said you have cattle. How many had—" "About 230 right now. Lost some to the drought in August." "And the land situation." He went still. "What do you mean?" "I mean your advertisement mentioned water rights issues. I read between that. There's a legal problem with your land." Her gray eyes didn't waver. "I keep accounts, Mr. Calhoun. I read documents. I notice what people don't say as much as what they do. Is there a legal challenge on the property? He set down his cornbread. 7 years he'd been managing that particular piece of information carefully, and this woman had deduced it from 6 words in a newspaper advertisement. There's a claim been filed against the North Pasture. Railroad company says the survey line put 30 acres of my best grazing land inside their right-of-way. Is the claim legitimate? No. Do you have documentation proving that? My father's original land patent from 1861. Then you need a lawyer who isn't friends with the railroad. Nate looked at her. You seem to know something about legal problems. The shift in her face was small, a tightening around the eyes, a half-second where the measuring look dropped and something rawer showed through before she pulled it back. I know something about powerful men using paperwork as a weapon, she said. Yes. Helen came back with the coffee pot. She refilled both cups and looked at Nate. Grace stopped by earlier, she said. Wanted to know what time you were expecting the stage. She paused. I told her 7-ish. I'll ride by her place tomorrow. Helen nodded, looked at Dorothy one more time, with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't curiosity, and left them alone. Your sister? Dorothy asked. Grace. She runs the neighboring spread with her husband Tom. She's... Nate paused. She'll want to meet you. Is that a warning? More of a preparation. He almost smiled. Grace don't ease into things. Dorothy looked at her coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it despite the warmth of the evening air, the way people do when they need to hold something solid. Mr. Calhoun. Her voice dropped half a note. I need to tell you something before we go any further. My letter was honest, but it wasn't complete. All right. I have a son. She pulled the photograph from her bodice and laid it on the table between them. A boy, maybe 5 years old, with dark hair and a gap-toothed grin, sitting on a porch step and squinting into the sun. His name is Robert, Bobby. My ex-husband, Leonard Wade, he has custody. A judge in St. Louis gave him full custody 8 months ago based on testimony that I was... She said the next words with a precision that made them sound like she'd carried them in her teeth for a long time. Morally unfit to raise a child. Nate didn't speak. I didn't do anything, Dorothy said. I want to be clear about that. Leonard arranged it. He knew the right people. He paid the right people, and he made sure I lost my teaching license at the same time, so I couldn't afford a lawyer who could fight him. He's done this before. Not to me, to the women before me. He takes what he wants, and when it stops being useful to him, he finds a legal mechanism to dispose of it. And Bobby. Bobby is the only thing Leonard has ever wanted that I won't let him have entirely. Her chin lifted. Leonard doesn't actually want to raise a child. He wants to win. He took Bobby to punish me for leaving, and he'll use him as leverage for as long as it's useful. When Bobby stops being leverage, he'll find another way to hurt me through him. She looked at Nate directly. I came to Kansas because establishing legal residence in a new territory as a married woman with a permanent address and income gives me grounds to repetition for custody in a federal court that isn't Leonard's personal property. It's a long shot. It may not work, but it's the only shot I have left. The restaurant was quiet around them. Through the window, Ridgeline's main street had gone dark except for the light from the saloon 2 blocks down. You used me, Nate said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact in the same tone Dorothy had used for her own facts. I answered your advertisement honestly. I told you I was a hard worker. I told you I could manage accounts and keep a household. Everything I wrote was true. She didn't look away. I didn't tell you about Bobby because I was afraid you'd say no, and I couldn't afford for you to say no. I might have said no. I know. Because I have my own legal troubles, and adding a custody dispute from St. Louis to the mix is complicated. I know that too. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. And I understand if that changes things. If you want to put me back on the stage tomorrow, I'll go. I won't make a scene and I won't blame you. I just needed you to know the truth before we signed anything. Nate looked at the photograph, The boy looked like his mother. Same eyes, same set to the jaw, even at 5 years old. The kind of face that was already deciding things. How long since you've seen him? Dorothy's composure cracked. Just at the edges. Just for a second. 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He set it down. He looked at the photograph a moment longer, then pushed it back across the table to her. Put that away safe. Mr. Calhoun. My name is Nate. He stood, reaching for his hat. Finish your stew. We've got 6 miles before full dark, and I'd rather not break a wheel in a ditch. Dorothy stared at him. You're not sending me back? Not tonight. He put his hat on. You lied to me by omission, which I don't appreciate. We'll discuss what that means for our arrangement when we're not both dead on our feet. But no. He looked at her steadily. I'm not sending you back tonight. She didn't cry. He noticed that. The way she'd held herself together through the whole conversation, the clinical precision of her language. The careful distance she kept, it was the composure of a woman who had decided that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. She just nodded once, short and quick, and picked up her spoon. Helen appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Nate. He looked at her. She went back into the kitchen without a word. Outside, the air had cooled to the particular sharpness of a Kansas September night, where the warmth of the day evaporates so fast, it's like the earth can't wait to be rid of it. Nate loaded Dorothy's single bag onto the wagon, and she climbed up herself before he could offer a hand. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, looking at the dark prairie road ahead of them like she was already calculating the distance. He climbed up, took the reins. The horses moved. They rode without speaking for the first mile. The sky out here was enormous, the kind of enormous that either humbled you or terrified you, depending on the state of your soul. Stars were coming out thick and low. You burned your life down to the foundation, he said finally. Coming here. Yes. Most people don't do that unless the house was already on fire. She was quiet for a long moment. The wagon wheels ground over the dry road. Leonard started the fire, she said. I just made sure I wasn't inside when it got to the roof. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. Another mile of silence. Different silence, though. Less hostile. Your ranch, she said. What do you need most right now? Practically speaking. The accounts are a mess. I've been keeping them myself since my last hand left in June, and I'm better with cattle than numbers. North pasture fence needs 2 days of work, but I can't spare 2 days from the herd right now, and the root cellar isn't stocked enough for winter, which means rides into town I don't have time for. I can do the accounts. I'll need to see everything: contracts, expenses, the railroad claim documents. She paused. Is there a notary in Ridgeline? Henry Marsh. Why? Because if I'm going to file a custody repetition in federal court, I need to establish our marriage as a legal matter of record quickly and clearly, so there's no room for Leonard to argue the timeline. She turned to look at him. The sooner we marry, the stronger my legal standing. I had planned on the weekend. Pastor Briggs. Tomorrow would be better. Nate looked at her. The moonlight had come up enough to see her face clearly now, and what he saw was not a woman being reckless. It was a woman executing a plan she'd been refining for 8 months, and every hour mattered to her in a way he couldn't fully understand yet, but intended to. Tomorrow, he said. All right. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He turned his eyes back to the road. You haven't seen the accounts. Something shifted in her face that might, in different circumstances and better lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't quite get there. But the possibility of it was there, and that was more than she'd shown in the 3 hours since she'd stepped off that stage. The ranch appeared over the last rise, a solid 2-room cabin, a barn, a bunkhouse that had been empty for 6 months, a corral, and the dark shapes of cattle moving on the far hill. Not grand, not prosperous, but real. Squared timbers and a good roof and a creek that hadn't run dry even in the drought, which was more than a lot of this county could say. Dorothy looked at it for a long time without speaking. "It ain't much," Nate said. It was the same thing he'd said to himself every morning for 7 years. "It has a fence," she said. "It does. A real fence, all the way around. Most of the way. South side needs work." She looked at the fence line, the cabin, the dark windows. "Does the door lock?" He glanced at her. "It does." "Then it's enough." She climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, and he let her because he had the sense that Dorothy Wade was a woman who needed to put her own feet on the ground in her own time. He unloaded her bag and walked her inside. Single lamp burning on the table. 2 rooms. He'd put clean linens on the spare bed the day before, and left a pitcher and basin on the dresser, which was the extent of his domestic preparation, and he was aware it was not impressive. She walked through the room, ran her hand over the window frame, looked at the lock on the door. She turned to him. "Mr. Calhoun." She stopped herself. "Nate." "Yeah. I want you to know something." She stood in the middle of the small room with her carpet bag at her feet and her gray eyes steady. "I intend to work for everything I get here, every day. I'm not a woman who takes without giving back." "I know you're not. You can't know that yet." "I know enough." He set her bag down. "Your letter told me, not what you wrote, what you didn't." He picked up the lamp from the table and handed it to her. "Spare room's yours. There's a bolt on the inside. You use it if it helps you sleep." She took the lamp, looked at the bolt. "You put that on yourself. Put it on yesterday when I figured you were coming." She didn't say anything for a moment. Her throat moved. That was considerate. It was practical. He moved toward the door. "Breakfast is before sunrise on a working ranch. You don't have to be up for it. First day you can—" "I'll be up," she said. He stopped in the doorway. Outside, the prairie was making its nighttime sounds, wind through the grass, a coyote calling from somewhere up toward the ridge, the horses settling in the corral. "Dorothy." He said her name for the first time. She looked at him. "Whatever happened to you in St. Louis? Whatever that man did to get that judge to sign those papers?" He held her gaze. "It ends at the county line. You're in Kansas now. And the way I see it, a man who'd take a child from his mother to win an argument ain't a man worth the paper his court order was printed on." She stood very still. "That doesn't mean it'll be easy," he said. "It don't mean I've got answers. I've got a ranch in trouble, and a legal fight of my own, and no guarantees about anything. But I'm telling you right now." His voice was level. "Nobody takes anything else from you while you're standing on my land. Not without going through me first." Dorothy's grip on the lamp tightened until her knuckles went white again. She looked at the photograph she'd placed on the dresser, Bobby's gap-toothed grin squinting into the sun. She looked back at Nate. "Get some rest," he said. And he walked out and pulled the door shut behind him. She stood alone in the small room for a long time. The lamp threw a warm circle of light. The bolt on the door was solid iron, newly fitted. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves, the same sound the prairie made, whether you were happy or broken, or somewhere in the hard country between the two. Dorothy Wade set the lamp on the dresser. She slid the bolt shut. She sat on the edge of the bed, picked up her son's photograph, and pressed it to her sternum with both hands, and for exactly 60 seconds she allowed herself to feel everything she'd been holding back for 8 months and 2 weeks and 4 days. Then she set the photograph back on the dresser, where she could see it from the pillow, lay down in her clothes, and went to sleep. In the next room, Nate Calhoun sat at his table for a long time in the dark, listening to the prairie breathe and thinking about a woman who'd asked him for one thing, a man who would not lie, and about how long it had been since anyone had asked him for something that simple, that he was still capable of giving. He thought about the photograph of a little boy with his mother's eyes sitting on a porch step somewhere in St. Louis, not knowing his mother was sleeping on a cattle ranch in Kansas, 6 miles from the nearest town, planning how to bring him home. He blew out his lamp and lay back on his bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow there was a fence to fix, and cattle to move, and a woman to marry, and a legal fight to plan, and a railroad company that wanted 30 acres of his best grass, and somewhere east of here, a man named Leonard Wade, who thought he'd already won. Nathaniel Calhoun had been in worse positions. He closed his eyes. Outside Ridgeline settled into the deep silence of a Kansas night, and in a small cabin 6 miles from town, 2 people who had each lost something that could not be replaced lay in separate rooms with the same thought working quietly through them like water finding its way through stone. Not finished yet. Dorothy was up before the lamp needed lighting. Nate heard her the moment her feet hit the floor, the soft creak of the spare room boards, the sound of the basin being filled from the pitcher, the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned to move through a house without disturbing it. He was already dressed, had been since 4:30, which was his habit, had been his habit since the war, when sleeping past first light felt like tempting fate. He was at the stove when she came out, her hair pinned back tight, her gray dress exchanged for a darker one, brown wool practical, with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow. She looked at the stove, at the coffee pot, at the 2 cups he'd set out, and then she looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something partway between. "You made coffee," she said. "I can manage coffee." He handed her a cup. "Eggs are another matter. I usually burn them." "I noticed the pan." She took the cup and moved toward the stove without being asked, picked up the pan and looked at the scorched residue along the bottom with the calm assessment of someone who had inherited worse. "Do you have salt pork?" "Cellar." "Biscuits." "I can make biscuits." She looked at him the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has just said something confidently incorrect. "Where's the flour?" He pointed. She found the flour, the lard, the salt, and had biscuits in the cast-iron skillet before he'd finished his first cup. She moved around his kitchen like she was solving a problem, quick, purposeful, no wasted motion. He watched her without watching her the way he'd learned to do the night before, and what he saw was a woman who needed to be useful the same way some people need to breathe. Not for him, for herself. They ate at the table without much talking, which suited him. Outside, the sky was going from black to gray, to the particular pale gold of a Kansas morning, and the cattle were starting to move on the far hill. "I want to see the accounts today," Dorothy said, pushing her plate aside. "I'll pull everything after the morning feed." "And the railroad claim documents." "Dorothy." He set his cup down. "We're getting married this morning." She went still, not alarmed, recalibrating. "Pastor Briggs. I sent word yesterday before I rode out to meet the stage. He's expecting us at 9. She looked at the window at the light. It was maybe 6:30. "All right," she said. "That leaves time for the accounts." He almost smiled. He kept it to himself. "After the ceremony. The accounts aren't going anywhere. Neither is Leonard, but every day matters." "I know every day matters." His voice was steady. "So does doing things in the right order. We get married legal and witnessed, then we build the case, one thing at a time." She looked at him across the table. He could see her working through it the same way she'd worked through the kitchen this morning, assessing what was there, what was missing, what could be made functional. "You understand what we're building this case for," she said. "What I'm asking you to take on. A custody fight with a St. Louis lawyer who owns judges. Potentially a long one, potentially expensive, potentially Dorothy." He leaned forward. "I said one thing at a time. That means I'm not borrowing trouble from next month before we've gotten through this morning. You want a plan. I understand that. Planning kept you alive and moving for the last 8 months, and I respect it. But right now, the most useful thing you can do is eat the rest of those biscuits because they're good, and you made them, and you're still too thin." She looked at the remaining biscuit on her plate. A long pause. Then she picked it up. He rode out to do the morning feed. She washed the dishes. When he came back in an hour, she had changed into the best dress she owned. Dark blue, high collar, a small row of buttons at the wrist, and had done something more careful with her hair. It was not a bridal dress. It was simply the best she had, and she wore it with the same straightforward dignity she wore everything else. Ridgeline on a Wednesday morning was quiet enough that a horse and wagon rolling down the main street drew exactly the kind of attention a small Kansas town gives to anything that breaks the routine, which is to say, every eye that could find a window found one. Pete Aldridge was sweeping his porch when they passed. He stopped sweeping. Mabel Krause, who ran the dry goods store, stepped to her doorway and stared openly. Two men outside the saloon, which was not yet open but whose owners were apparently already present, watched without pretending not to. Dorothy kept her eyes forward. Nate kept his on the road. He noted the looks with the peripheral awareness of a man who had lived in a small town long enough to know that gossip traveled faster than any horse he'd ever owned, and that by noon, everyone in Ridgeline and several people on outlying farms would know that Nathaniel Calhoun had brought in a woman on the evening stage and married her the next morning. "They're staring," Dorothy said. "They are. Does that bother you?" "No. Does it bother you?" She considered. "I've had worse things than stares." She paused. In St. Louis, Leonard made sure people stared. He'd arrange for things to be said. At church, at the market, little things that added up. The way a woman looks crazy before anyone calls her crazy. She said it without emotion, reporting it the way she'd reported everything. Stares here feel almost quaint. Nate pulled the wagon up outside the small white church at the north end of the street. Pastor Elias Briggs was waiting on the steps. A spare, careful man in his 60s who had performed marriages and funerals with equal solemnity for 20 years, and who looked now at Dorothy with the polite blankness of a man determined not to form opinions before he had facts. "Nathaniel," he said. "Elias." Nate helped Dorothy down from the wagon. "This is Dorothy Wade, soon to be Dorothy Calhoun." "Miss Wade." Briggs extended his hand. "Welcome to Ridgeline." "Thank you, Pastor." She shook it once firm. "I'll need 2 witnesses." Briggs looked at the street. "I asked Helen Cross and Roy Dempsey." As if the names had summoned them, Helen appeared from across the street, still in her apron, and behind her came Sheriff Roy Dempsey, 62, lean as a fence rail, with a silver badge that had seen better days and eyes that had seen everything. He nodded at Nate. He looked at Dorothy. His expression did not change, but something shifted in it that was not unfriendly. "Miss Wade," Dempsey said. "Sheriff?" "Dempsey's fine." He held the church door. "Shall we?" The ceremony took 11 minutes. No music, no flowers, no ceremony beyond the words themselves, which Briggs delivered with the simple gravity of a man who believed that vows were the most serious thing a person could say, and that surrounding them with decoration only diluted them. Dorothy answered each question clearly without hesitation, her voice steady as river stone. When Briggs said, "You may seal your vows," Nate turned to her. She turned to him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. 2 people who had agreed to something large and uncertain on the basis of 3 paragraphs and 1 night's conversation. And then Dorothy rose onto her toes and kissed him once, quick and deliberate, her hand briefly against his jaw. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a declaration. "I am here. This is real. It counts." When they signed the certificate, Dorothy's pen did not waver. She wrote Dorothy Calhoun in a clean, clear hand and set the pen down and looked at the name for exactly 2 seconds before folding her hands in her lap. Helen blew her nose into her apron. "Well," she said. Dempsey signed as witness and handed the pen to Helen. "Congratulations," he said, in the flat tone of a man for whom the word was functional rather than decorative, which was somehow more convincing than elaborate warmth would have been. Outside the church, Helen caught Dorothy's arm. "You come to the restaurant for supper tonight. Both of you. I won't hear otherwise." She paused. "And I heard what you said at the table last night about your boy." Dorothy went still. "You weren't meant to hear that." "I wasn't meant to hear a lot of things I hear. That kitchen doesn't have a door. It has a curtain." Helen's voice dropped. My granddaughter lost custody of her son 2 years ago in a county dispute. I know what that looks like on a person's face. I know what it costs. She squeezed Dorothy's arm once. You need anything in this town, you come to me. Understood. Dorothy looked at her. Yes, ma'am. Good. Helen let go. Now go look at whatever accounts Nate's been mangling and try not to judge him too harshly. Back at the ranch, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with 6 months of Nate's record-keeping spread in front of her and did not say a word for 40 minutes. Nate worked at the sink, found things to organize, gave her the space. He had a system, he knew that. He also knew it was a system that made sense only to him, and possibly not even entirely to him anymore. This entry, she said finally, without looking up. August 14th, $42 paid to the Ridgeline Supply Company. Feed and fencing wire. It's listed under personal expenses. Well, I personally needed it. She looked up. There was something in her expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement, and was very specifically the expression of a woman trying to determine which category of problem she was dealing with. That affects your tax basis, Nate. If the railroad's using the county assessor's records to challenge your land value, a miscategorized $42 becomes an argument in their favor. He leaned against the counter. I didn't know that. That's why you needed an accountant. She turned back to the ledger. I'll need 2 days to go through all of this. Where are the railroad claim documents? He pulled a leather satchel from the top shelf of the cabinet beside the hearth, the one he only opened when he couldn't avoid it. He set it on the table beside her. She untied it and began to read. He watched her read. She had a quality of stillness when she focused that reminded him of a hawk. Not passive stillness, but the stillness of something gathering itself. Her pen moved steadily, making notes on a separate sheet in a small, precise hand. Occasionally she made a sound that was not a word, just a note to herself, and turned a page. After a while he said, Well, the survey discrepancy goes back to 1873. She didn't look up. The railroad's claim references a federal survey conducted that year, but your father's original land patent from 1861 predates that survey. If the 1873 survey was conducted after your father took legal possession, it cannot retroactively alter the boundary. She tapped the page. However, they know that, which means this isn't about the survey. It's about attrition. They file, they delay, they make the legal process expensive enough that you give up and sell. That's what my father's lawyer told me before he died. Do you have a current lawyer? Had one. Left for Denver in June. Then we find another one. She turned a page. There's a federal land office in Abilene. A petition filed there with your original patent documents would create a counter-record before the railroad can push this to a territorial hearing. That needs to happen before the end of the month. Nate pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He looked at the satchel at the papers at the woman who had been in his house for less than a day, and had just articulated the clearest strategy he'd heard for a problem that had kept him awake for 3 years. You learned all that from being a school teacher. I learned it from being married to a lawyer who used every one of those techniques against me. She said it without looking up, and the flatness in her voice was not bitterness. It was something harder than bitterness, something that had been compressed by 8 months of pressure into something almost like clarity. I know how Leonard thinks because I watched him think for 4 years. I know exactly how a man with money and legal connections dismantles someone who has less of both. She finally looked up. And I know what they look for. A woman alone with no address, no income, no standing. A woman who can be made to seem unstable. Her gray eyes were level. I am none of those things anymore. Nate held her gaze. No, he said, you're not. The afternoon came and went. Dorothy worked through the ledgers with the systematic patience of someone who had nothing to prove and a very clear goal. Nate moved between the barn and the fence line and the kitchen, where he managed to boil water successfully and make coffee that Dorothy accepted without comment, which he took as a positive sign. It was Grace who arrived at 4 o'clock, riding in the way Grace always rode fast, without announcement, with the assumption that whatever she was interrupting could wait. She was 35, with Nate's same dark hair going gray at the temples, and the Calhoun jaw that both siblings had inherited from their father, which meant it was built for holding positions whether or not holding them was practical. She tied her horse at the post and walked through the front door without knocking, which was also consistent. Dorothy looked up from the table. Grace looked at Dorothy. Nate looked at both of them from the doorway to the back room and decided to remain there temporarily. "You're Dorothy," Grace said. "I am." Dorothy set down her pen. "You're Grace. Nate told you about me. He said you don't ease into things." Grace's mouth twitched. "That's polite for what he usually says." She walked to the table, looked at the spread of papers without touching them. "What are you doing?" "Reorganizing your brother's accounts and preparing a counter-petition against the railroad's land claim." A pause. Grace looked at Nate. He kept his expression neutral. She looked back at Dorothy. "You've been here one day." "Almost two," Dorothy said. "We lost some hours to the ceremony this morning." Grace pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me." Nate quietly returned to the kitchen and made more coffee. By the time he brought 2 cups out, Dorothy and Grace were bent over the same page, Dorothy pointing and Grace asking rapid questions that Dorothy answered with the same precise economy she used for everything. He set the cups down between them. Neither woman looked up. He went back to the kitchen and made a cup for himself, and stood there listening to his sister ask questions she'd been trying to ask someone for 3 years, and his wife of 6 hours answer them like she'd been waiting just as long to be asked. It was nearly 6 when Grace finally leaned back in her chair and looked at Dorothy with the particular expression she reserved for things she'd decided to approve of, not warm exactly, but solid. Definitive. "You know what you're doing?" Grace said. "Yes." "Nate doesn't with numbers, no offense to him." "None taken," Nate said from the kitchen. "We'll need someone in Abilene," Grace said. "A lawyer who doesn't have railroad money in his pocket. Tom's cousin worked land claims out there 2 years ago. I can write him." "That would help." "Consider it done." Grace stood, picked up her coffee. She looked at Dorothy one more time, and then she did something Nate had seen his sister do exactly 3 times in his adult life. She said nothing further. She just nodded. The nod that meant she'd made her assessment, and it was favorable. And that was as much as she was going to give, which from Grace Calhoun was as close to a declaration of loyalty as most people ever got. She took her coffee cup to the door, stopped. "Supper at my place Sunday," she said. "Both of you." "We'll be there," Nate said. Grace left. Her horse was already moving before the door had fully shut. Dorothy looked at the closed door. Then she looked at her notes. Then she looked at Nate, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Your sister is—" "Grace is Grace," he said. "There's no word that covers it entirely. She's on our side. She's been on my side since 1848, and she's never once made it comfortable. But she's steady." He paused. "That's worth more than comfortable." Dorothy turned back to the papers. He watched her hand move across the ledger, her pen scratching the small, precise numbers that would either save his land or fail to, and thought about 8 months and 2 weeks and 4 days, and about a little boy in St. Louis with his mother's gray eyes, who did not yet know that his mother was already building the case that would come for him. And he thought about a man named Leonard Wade, somewhere east of here, who believed as men, like that always believed, that he had already won. Outside the Kansas prairie held its breath the way it did before a weather change, and the cattle moved slow and dark against the fading sky, and the fence on the north pasture needed work, and there were 100 things that needed doing and not enough hands to do them. And Nathaniel Calhoun stood in his kitchen on the evening of his wedding day and felt for the first time in 7 years that the math of his life might actually be adding up to something instead of away from it. He didn't say that out loud. He was not a man who said things like that out loud. But he stood there and let himself feel it for a moment quietly, the way you let yourself feel warmth from a fire before you trust that it won't go out. Then he started making supper because it was getting dark, and the accounts could wait, and Dorothy Calhoun had not eaten since the biscuits she'd made at dawn, and feeding the people in his house was the one thing he knew how to do right, and he intended to do it. The letter from Leonard arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after the wedding. Nate brought it in from the postwriter without looking at it, set it on the table beside Dorothy's ledger work, and went back outside. He knew what it was the moment he saw the St. Louis postmark, and the precise, unhurried penmanship on the envelope, the handwriting of a man who had never once written anything in a hurry, because hurrying implied that someone else's time mattered. Dorothy recognized it before she picked it up. She sat with it in her hand for a moment, not opening it, just holding it the way you hold something you know is going to hurt before you let it. Then she opened it. She read it standing up, which Nate noticed when he came back in for the noon meal. She had not sat down. She was standing at the table with the letter in both hands and her back to the door, and the set of her shoulders told him everything before she turned around. "He knows," she said. "He knows about the marriage, the ranch, all of it. How long did you think it would take him?" "I thought we'd have more time." She set the letter on the table. "He has contacts in Kansas City, someone who tracks filings at the county level, apparently. Our marriage certificate was registered 8 days ago." She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth, thinking. "He's filed a motion in St. Louis to have the marriage invalidated on the grounds that I entered into it under false pretenses, concealing my status as a party to an active custody proceeding." Nate pulled out a chair and sat down. "Can he do that?" "His argument is that I deceived you, that you wouldn't have married me if you'd known about Bobby and the custody dispute." She picked up the letter again, read the relevant line aloud. "The petitioner contends that Mrs. Calhoun, formerly Miss Dorothy Wade, withheld material information from Mr. Nathaniel Calhoun prior to their union rendering said union voidable under Missouri contract law." She set it down. "He's trying to apply Missouri contract law to a Kansas marriage. That doesn't hold." "No, it doesn't. Kansas courts aren't bound by Missouri family law precedent. But the motion creates delay, and delay is what he wants. Every week this drags on is a week Bobby stays in Leonard's house." Her voice didn't crack. It had the compressed quality it always had when she was talking about her son, not emotional flatness, but emotional compression, like something very hot forced into a very small space. "He also says he intends to come to Kansas personally to assess the situation." The kitchen went quiet. Outside, wind moved through the grass. "When?" Nate asked. "He doesn't say. That's deliberate. He wants me to not know when. He wants me watching the road." She folded the letter and set it at the far edge of the table away from her work papers, as if proximity mattered. "That's how he operates. He plants the uncertainty and lets it grow. Then we don't let it grow." Nate looked at the letter. "Has Grace heard back from Tom's cousin, the lawyer in Abilene?" "Yesterday. His name is Frank Alderman. He agreed to take the railroad case, and he's willing to look at the custody situation. He needs to see the original St. Louis court filings." She paused. "Which I don't have. I left St. Louis with Bobby's photograph and $32 and the clothes I was wearing. I didn't have time to gather documents." Who would have them? Dorothy thought. My former colleague at the school, Margaret Hollis. She kept copies of everything Leonard filed against my teaching license because she didn't trust that the school board's records would stay intact. She suspected Leonard had influence with the board, which he did. She looked at Nate. If she still has them, and if she's willing to send them, we'd have the original fraudulent testimony. The lies Leonard told under oath to strip my credentials. That connects directly to the pattern of false statements he made to get Bobby. Write to her tonight. I intend to. She sat down finally and pulled her ledger back in front of her. There's something else in the letter, at the bottom. She didn't reach for it. He says Bobby asks about me. Nate was very still. He says Bobby asks about me, and that he tells him I'm traveling, and that I'll come home when I'm ready. Her pen was in her hand, but she wasn't writing. He says that Bobby believes I left voluntarily, that I chose to be away. She set the pen down. That's the cruelest sentence he's ever written to me, and Leonard Wade has written me some very cruel sentences. Nate didn't speak right away because he'd learned that Dorothy didn't need him to rush into her silences. She needed him to stay in them without flinching. He sat there while the clock on the mantel measured out 30 seconds of quiet. Bobby knows his mother, he said then. Kids know. Whatever Leonard tells him, some part of that boy knows it isn't right. Dorothy picked up her pen. I know, she said, and went back to the ledger. She wrote to Margaret Hollis that evening. She also wrote to Frank Alderman in Abilene, laying out the timeline of the custody case with the same methodical precision she brought to the ranch accounts. Nate sat across the table reading the railroad survey documents and occasionally asking her questions. She answered without looking up, and by the time they went to bed, the lamp had burned low, and both of them had filled several pages, and the kitchen table looked like the planning room of a small, determined army. It was the following Monday that Leonard arrived. Not alone. He never went anywhere alone. Nate was in the north pasture mending the fence line when Pete Aldridge rode out from town, which was unusual enough in itself that Nate stopped working before Pete had pulled his horse up. Pete's face had the particular expression of a man delivering news he found more interesting than alarming, which meant it was probably alarming. Got a visitor in town, Pete said. Well-dressed, St. Louis accent. Came in on the morning stage with two other men and asked Pete Aldridge Sr., that's my father, you know, asked him where the Calhoun ranch was. Pete paused for effect. Gave his name as Wade. Nate set down the fence post. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the north pasture at the fence at the long flat line of the horizon. How long ago? Hour maybe. He's at the hotel. The two men with him took a room at the boarding house. One of 'em's carrying Iron Nate. I saw it under his coat. Nate picked up his tools and walked to his horse. He came in the back way through the kitchen door and found Dorothy already standing in the middle of the room. She had heard Pete ride in from the pasture. She had watched from the window. She knew. He's in town, she said. At the hotel. Nate set his tools by the door. Two men with him, one armed. She turned away from him and stood facing the window. Her arms crossed her back very straight, and he could see the muscles in her jaw working. He moves fast when he decides to, she said. I was hoping the legal filings would slow him down. He must have already known he was coming when he sent the letter. Probably sent it from Kansas City. Yes. She turned back. Her eyes were very clear. He'll come here. He won't go through the sheriff first, he'll come here. He believes in confronting things on the other person's ground because he thinks it rattles people. It does rattle people. He's very good at it. Dorothy. He'll try to speak to me alone if he can manage it. He'll try to get you away from the house first. He'll have a reason that sounds sensible. Dorothy. He said her name again, quieter, and she stopped. He walked to the cabinet beside the hearth, the one where he kept his father's old Colt revolver on the top shelf. He took it down, checked the cylinder, and set it on the table. Then he looked at her. You know how to use a revolver. She looked at the gun. My father taught me. Then that one's yours until this is resolved. He held her gaze. Not because I think you need me to hand you a weapon. Because you've been fighting this man with nothing but your own intelligence for 8 months, and I want you to have every available option. She looked at the revolver for a long moment. Then she picked it up, checked the cylinder herself with quick professional hands, and set it back down. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. He reached for his hat. I'm going to talk to Roy Dempsey. I'm coming with you. He paused. He could have argued. He looked at her face and recognized that this was not the moment for that particular argument. All right, let's go. Dempsey was at his desk when they walked in, which meant he'd heard already because Roy Dempsey was never at his desk at 2 in the afternoon unless he was waiting for something. He looked at them both, pointed at the 2 chairs across from him, and said, "Sit." They sat. "He arrived at 10:40, Dempsey said. "Leonard Hargrove Wade, attorney at law, St. Louis, Missouri. I checked the register myself. The 2 men with him are named Cutter and Briggs, no relation to the pastor, and yes, they are carrying firearms, which is legal, which is unfortunately the problem." He folded his hands on the desk. "He came to see me first." Dorothy went still. "He came to you first." Introduced himself very courteously, very professionally, presented me with a copy of the St. Louis custody order and the motion to invalidate your marriage, and informed me that he was here in a purely civil capacity to discuss the voluntary return of his son's mother to Missouri jurisdiction. Dempsey's voice was entirely without inflection. He used the words voluntary and civil approximately 6 times each. "What did you say?" Nate asked. "I said that Dorothy Calhoun was a legally married resident of Ridgeline, Kansas, and that no out-of-state civil court order gave him authority to dictate her movements. I said it politely." Dempsey unfolded his hands. He said he understood that and that he was simply hoping for a private conversation with his son's mother, which any reasonable person would surely understand. He said the word reasonable 4 times. Dorothy's hands were in her lap, and Nate could see them pressing together. "He'll come to the ranch," she said. "He told me once that he always meets problems on their own ground. He believes it gives him a psychological advantage." "It might," Dempsey said, "which is why you won't meet him on your own ground." He looked at Dorothy directly. "He comes to your ranch, you're isolated. It's 6 miles from town, the 2 men he brought stay back, and suddenly it's just a husband and wife having a private conversation that nobody else hears. That's his calculation. I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, and I know that calculation." He paused. "So here's what happens. If Leonard Wade wants to speak to you, he speaks to you here in my office with me in the room." "He won't agree to that," Dorothy said. "He doesn't have to agree. What he has to do is recognize that showing up at a woman's private residence with 2 armed men, after being told by the local sheriff to conduct himself through proper channels, would give me grounds to run him out of the county." Dempsey stood. "I'm going to the hotel now to make that point clearly." Dorothy stood. "I want to be there." Dempsey looked at her. "Mrs. Calhoun, he needs to see that I'm not afraid of him." She said it without heat, flat and final. "He came 2,000 miles because he expects me to be hiding behind my husband and my locked door. I need him to see that I'm not." Dempsey looked at Nate. Nate said nothing. This was not his call. Dempsey picked up his hat. "Then you walk beside me, not behind me, and you don't speak first. Let me make the opening." Agreed. Leonard Wade was in the hotel dining room when they arrived, which meant he had positioned himself publicly and visibly, another calculation harder to have a direct confrontation in front of witnesses, but also easier for him to control the optics of it. He was seated alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, and he looked up when they came in with the expression of a man who had been expecting exactly this and had prepared for it. He was younger looking than Nate had expected. 44, but carrying it like 40. Fair-haired, clean-shaved, in a dark suit that was expensive without being ostentatious. He rose when Dorothy entered, which was the kind of courtesy that was actually a dominance gesture. "I acknowledge you. I control the terms of acknowledgement." "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was warm. Genuinely warm-sounding, which Nate found more unsettling than open hostility would have been. "You look well." "Leonard." Her voice was level, not warm, not cold. Level the way a gun sight is level. Leonard's eyes moved to Nate with the particular assessment of a man who catalogs threats by instinct. He extended his hand. "You must be Mr. Calhoun." "Leonard Wade. I hope we can speak as reasonable men about a complicated situation." Nate shook the hand once. "I've been told you're reasonable. You used the word several times with the sheriff this morning." Something moved behind Leonard's polished expression. Not quite surprise. A recalibration. I see. He gestured toward the chairs across from him. Please sit. We'll stand, Dempsey said. Leonard sat back down slowly like a man making a choice. Very well. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. Dorothy, I came here because I think we can resolve this without lawyers and courts and the expense and unpleasantness that comes with them. Bobby misses you. Whatever our differences, I don't want him to grow up without knowing his mother. He's growing up without knowing me right now, Dorothy said, because you arranged it. I arranged it because a judge who reviewed the evidence. You arranged the evidence. Dorothy. The warmth in his voice went down 1 degree. I understand that you're angry. I've always understood that you're angry. But anger is exactly the behavior pattern the judge cited in his ruling, and I'd encourage you to... Mr. Wade. Dempsey's voice cut through like a blade between 2 boards. What specifically do you want from this visit? Leonard looked at Dempsey. The look was the kind powerful men give to obstacles assessing, measuring, filing for future reference. I want to have a private conversation with my son's mother, that's all. A private conversation without a sheriff and a rancher in the room. He looked at Dorothy. Surely that's not an unreasonable request. It is, Nate said. Leonard's eyes moved to him. I wasn't speaking to you. I know you weren't. Nate's voice was entirely calm. But Dorothy is my wife, and she's standing in my county. And anything you have to say to her, you say in front of Roy Dempsey, or you say in front of me, or you say in writing to Frank Alderman in Abilene, who is our attorney. Those are your options. Your attorney? Leonard almost smiled. A cattle ranch lawyer from Abilene against a senior partner at Wade & Hutchins. He looked at Dorothy. I came here trying to find a reasonable solution. Bobby could be with you by Christmas. Supervised visits initially, but... Supervised, Dorothy said. It's the court's requirement, not mine. Nothing about this is the court's requirement. The court does what you pay it to do. Her voice hadn't risen. It was still level, still precise, but there was something underneath it now, like heat under floorboards, not visible, but very much present. Bobby is 5 years old, and you told him I left voluntarily. You told a 5-year-old child that his mother chose to go away. She took 1 step forward. I want you to hear me say this clearly, Leonard, in front of the sheriff and my husband and anyone else in this room who cares to listen. I am not coming back to Missouri. I am not entering into any arrangement that puts you between me and my son. And I am not afraid of you. Silence in the dining room. The 2 other occupied tables had gone very quiet. Leonard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nate, then at Dempsey. Whatever he was calculating behind those pleasant, patient eyes, he was calculating it very fast. All right, he said. His voice had gone smooth the way a river goes smooth right before it goes deep. I understand your position. He stood, straightened his jacket. But Dorothy, you should understand mine. I have a court order from Missouri, a motion in Kansas Territorial Court, and I have resources and patience that outlast any cattle ranch in the territory. He picked up his newspaper. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be in Ridgeline as long as it takes, and when you're ready to talk sensibly, I'll be here. He walked out. Not quickly. Deliberately. A man who moved at his own pace because he'd decided the world could wait. Dempsey watched him go. Then he turned to Dorothy. You all right? Yes. She was watching the door Leonard had walked through. He expected me to be more frightened than I am. He's adjusting. Adjusting to what? To the fact that I have people. She said it quietly, almost to herself, like she was still getting used to what the words meant. Then she straightened. We need to contact Frank Alderman today. If Leonard files in Kansas Territorial Court, we need to be ahead of it. I'll send a wire from the telegraph office, Nate said. I'll write the details. She turned to Dempsey. Thank you, Roy. Don't thank me yet, Dempsey said, which was almost exactly what Nate had said to her the night she arrived, and she noticed the echo of it, and something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shape. Outside the main street of Ridgeline went about its business, unhurried, dusty, indifferent to the calculations of men from St. Louis. Dorothy walked beside Nate toward the telegraph office, her shoulder an inch from his arm, close enough that their movement synchronized without contact, and he was aware of that proximity, the way you are aware of warmth, not dramatically, but constantly. "He has 2 men with him," she said as they walked. "I know. He didn't bring them to look intimidating. He brought them because he intends to do something he needs cover for." She kept her eyes forward. "Leonard doesn't make expensive gestures. Everything he does has a function." Nate thought about the north pasture 6 miles out, and the fence that still needed 2 days of work, and the nights when Dorothy was alone in the house, and he was in the barn or the far field. He thought about the Colt revolver on the kitchen table. "Grace is coming over tomorrow," he said. Dorothy glanced at him. "You're going to ask her to stay at the house." "I'm going to ask her to be around." "That's the same thing." "Maybe." He held the telegraph office door for her. "Grace won't mind. She's been looking for a reason to reorganize my house since 1871. Dorothy walked through the door. She stopped just inside, turned to look at him with her gray eyes that missed very little. "Nate." The way she said his name had changed in 12 days. It had settled, found its weight. "He's not going to make this easy." "I know. He's going to come after the ranch, the land claim. He'll find a way to connect himself to the railroad company's case or manufacture a new one. He has the money to be creative." "I know that too." "And you're not worried." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't say I wasn't worried. I said I knew." He moved to the counter. "There's a difference between worrying and knowing. Worrying is what he wants you to do. Knowing is what we work with." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the notes she'd written at the ranch that morning, detailed ordered everything Frank Alderman would need to file their counterposition before Leonard could get ahead of them. She set them on the counter. "Then let's work," she said. And somewhere in the Ridgeline Hotel, Leonard Wade sat in his room with his hands folded and his coffee going cold, looking out at the Kansas street below, making new calculations because the woman he'd spent 4 years convincing herself was nothing without him, was standing in a telegraph office 2 blocks away, building something out of nothing, the way she had always been able to do, and the way he had always at some level, he would never admit, been afraid of. Frank Alderman arrived from Abilene on a Friday, 3 days after the telegraph wire, riding a roan horse that had seen better decades, and carrying a leather satchel that had not. He was 50 compact, with a sun-weathered face, and the kind of eyes that had spent 20 years reading documents looking for the one sentence that changed everything. He shook Nate's hand in the yard, looked at the ranch with the assessment of a man pricing things, and then walked inside and shook Dorothy's hand and said, "Show me everything." They spent 4 hours at the kitchen table. Dorothy laid out the St. Louis custody, filing the motion to invalidate the marriage, Leonard's letter, and the notes she'd compiled on the railroad land claim, because she had figured out by day 2 of reading those documents that the 2 problems were not unrelated. Alderman read without interrupting, occasionally making a sound in the back of his throat that could have meant anything, and when he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You're right about the railroad," he said to Dorothy. "The 1873 survey can't override a federal land patent from 1861. That case should have been thrown out when they filed it." He tapped the stack of papers. "The reason it wasn't thrown out is because the district judge handling it is Calvin Morse, and Calvin Morse has had a financial relationship with the Kansas Pacific for approximately 9 years. He looked at Nate. "I can't prove that in a week. But I can file an emergency injunction in federal court citing jurisdictional conflict, which kicks it out of Morse's courtroom and buys us time." "How much time?" Nate asked. 6 weeks? Maybe 8. "And the custody situation?" Dorothy asked. Alderman looked at her with the directness of a man who had learned that the kindest thing he could offer clients was clarity. "The Missouri order is real, and it's been entered into the state record. Reversing it requires either proving the original testimony was fraudulent, which means finding the people who lied under oath and getting them to admit it, or establishing changed circumstances significant enough that a Kansas federal judge would override Missouri family court. He paused. Your marriage and legal Kansas residency constitute changed circumstances. They're not enough on their own, but combined with evidence of the fraudulent testimony they could be. Margaret Hollis, Dorothy said. My colleague. I wrote to her 2 weeks ago. She hasn't replied. She may be afraid. She is afraid. She was afraid when I was still there. Dorothy's pen was in her hand, turning slowly between her fingers. Leonard's lawyer threatened her when she tried to speak to the school board on my behalf. He told her she'd lose her position. Has she kept the documents you mentioned? The copies of the original filings. She said she would. Whether she still has them. Dorothy set the pen down. I need to go to St. Louis. The kitchen went quiet. Nate looked at her. Alderman looked at her. She looked at neither of them, just at the papers on the table working through it, the way she worked through everything methodically already 3 steps ahead. Leonard is here, Nate said. Which means he's not in St. Louis. His lawyers are in St. Louis, but Leonard himself controls the pressure he puts on Margaret. Without him there, she might talk to me. She looked up. He came here to intimidate me into coming back to Missouri on his terms. I'm not going on his terms, but going on my own terms with a purpose he doesn't anticipate while he's sitting in the Ridgeline Hotel, waiting for me to be frightened? She stopped. It's the last thing he'd expect. It's also the last thing I'd expect, Nate said. That's not a no. It's not a yes either. He leaned forward. You'd be in St. Louis alone. Leonard's people are there. His lawyers are there. The judge who signed the original order is there. I'd be a married woman in a city where I lived for 6 years with people who know me. I know St. Louis far better than Leonard knows Ridgeline. She held Nate's gaze. And Margaret Hollis will not put anything in writing. She won't. Not while Leonard's lawyer is a block from her school. I have to go in person. Alderman cleared his throat. She's not wrong about the logic. Nate looked at him. I'm just saying the legal strategy is sound, Alderman said with the tone of a man choosing neutrality carefully. Nate stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to both of them, looking out at the pasture. Dorothy watched his shoulders. She had learned his body language in the weeks they'd been married, the way you learn the weather patterns of a particular place, not because anyone taught you, but because your survival depends on reading it correctly. Those shoulders were not angry. They were working through something. 3 days, he said without turning. You go, you get the documents, you come back. 3 days. Nate. If you're not back in 3 days, I'm coming to St. Louis. He turned. And I'll bring Grace, which will be considerably worse for everyone involved. Something moved in Dorothy's face. It was not quite the smile she rarely showed, but it was adjacent to it. 3 days, she agreed. She left on the morning stage 2 days later before Leonard could hear about it through whatever network of information he'd built in Ridgeline, which Dempsey confirmed was real. One of the men he'd brought Cutter had been asking around town in the way that looked like casual conversation, and wasn't. She carried one bag, Bobby's photograph, and the address of Margaret Hollis's boarding house on Elm Street, and she did not look back when the stage pulled out, because looking back had never once helped her, and she had stopped doing it sometime around the 6th month of the worst year of her life. Nate watched the stage go from outside the relay station. Pete Aldridge did not make any comments, which was either sensitivity or self-preservation. Then Nate rode back to the ranch, worked the fence line, moved 50 head of cattle to the south pasture, and fixed the broken hinge on the barn door that had been irritating him since August. He did not think about the stage or street, Lewis or Leonard Wade, sitting in the hotel 2 miles away. He thought about it constantly. Leonard came to the ranch on the second morning. Nate was in the barn when he heard the horse. He came out to find Leonard Wade dismounting at the post with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life arrived somewhere and been unwelcome. One of the men, Cutter, the one Dempsey had identified, stayed back on the road. Leonard walked into the yard as if he'd been invited. "Mr. Calhoun." He looked at the cabin at the barn at the corral. "Lovely property." "It's a working ranch." Nate stayed where he was, 10 feet away, thumbs in his belt. "Dorothy isn't here." Something flickered in Leonard's expression. "I know. She left on Thursday's stage." He looked at Nate with the patient measuring look that Nate was beginning to recognize as his default expression, the one that said, "I already know more than you think." "I came to speak to you." "Speak then." Leonard looked at the barn, at the fields at the horizon, with the calm of a man admiring a painting. "You have a good operation here. Not large, but solid. Good water access. The north pasture issue is unfortunate, but resolvable, I imagine, with the right connections." Nate said nothing. "I have connections," Leonard said. "With the Kansas Pacific specifically. The land dispute you're facing, the survey disagreement, these things have a way of being resolved very quickly when the right people decide to resolve them." He paused. "Or very slowly when they decide not to." "Is that an offer or a threat?" "It's an observation." Leonard turned to face him. "I think we're both practical men. I came a long way, and I'd like to go home. Dorothy is—" He stopped, chose his words. "Dorothy is a determined woman. She always has been. I respected that about her once. But she has constructed a version of our marriage in her mind that bears very little resemblance to what actually happened, and she has shared that version with you and with the people in this town, and I understand why you believe her." He looked at Nate directly. "I'm asking you to consider that you've known her for 3 weeks, and I knew her for 4 years. "I've known her long enough," Nate said. "Long enough to stake your land on her version of events. My land's got nothing to do with Dorothy." "Doesn't it?" Leonard's voice stayed smooth, stayed warm, and that warmth was the most dangerous thing about him. Nate thought it never quite left, even when what he was saying was a direct threat. "The Kansas Pacific's claim against your north pasture, I did some research. The attorney filing on their behalf is Harold Kress out of Kansas City. Harold Kress and I have known each other for 15 years. He let that settle. "I'm not saying I have influence over a legal proceeding, Mr. Calhoun. I'm saying that legal proceedings involving Harold Kress tend to move in directions that Harold Kress finds professionally advantageous, and Harold Kress finds me professionally useful." Nate's hands came out of his belt. He did not step forward. He held himself where he was with the deliberate stillness of a man who had walked through cannon fire and learned that moving before you were ready got you killed. "I want you to hear me clearly," he said. "You drove Dorothy out of her home, took her son, and used a court of law to call her a liar. And now you're standing in my yard threatening my land to get her back." He held Leonard's gaze. "I don't know what kind of men you deal with in St. Louis, but I want you to understand what kind of man you're dealing with here. I have buried friends. I have buried my father. I have held this land through drought and debt and a legal fight that has been running for 3 years, and I am still standing on it." He took one step forward. "You cannot threaten me with anything I haven't already survived." Leonard looked at him for a long moment. The warmth in his expression was still there, but underneath it, something else was visible now, something that watched Nate the way it had been watching Dorothy all along, not with contempt, but with the cold, patient attention of a man who does not accept the existence of things he cannot control. "You're a better man than I expected," Leonard said finally. "Dorothy has good instincts, whatever else I might say about her." He picked up his horse's reins. "Think about what I've said, Mr. Calhoun. The offer regarding the land claim is genuine. I gain nothing from your financial ruin. I only want my son's mother where I can ensure Bobby's stability." He mounted. "I'll be at the hotel. The offer has a limited shelf life." He rode out. Cutter fell in beside him on the road without a word exchanged between them. Nate stood in the yard until they were gone, and then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the railroad documents and at Dorothy's handwriting in the ledger margins and at the Colt revolver still sitting where she'd left it, and thought about Harold Kress in Kansas City and Frank Alderman in Abilene, and the 6 weeks an injunction might buy them, and whether 6 weeks was enough. Then he saddled his horse and rode to Grace's. His sister was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she took one look at his face and poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down and said, "Tell me." He told her everything. Leonard's visit, the offer regarding Harold Kress, the railroad connection, the 3-day window while Dorothy was in St. Louis. Grace listened without interrupting, which was unlike her, and which told him she understood the weight of it. When he finished, she wrapped her hands around her cup. "He's not going to use the railroad claim as leverage the way he described," she said. "What do you mean? He didn't come here to offer you a deal, Nate. He came here to see if you'd take it. There's a difference." She looked at him. A man like Leonard Wade doesn't actually resolve problems. He catalogs weaknesses. He came to your ranch to find out whether you'd sell Dorothy to protect your land. He wanted to know your price. Nate sat with that. "And if I don't have one?" Then he escalates. "He's already filed in territorial court. He'll file something else. He'll manufacture a reason." She set down her cup. "What did Frank say about the injunction?" 6 weeks, maybe 8. "Is that enough time for Dorothy to get what she needs from St. Louis? If Margaret Hollis has the documents, if she'll give them up, Dorothy will get them." Grace said it with the flat certainty of someone stating a mathematical fact. "I've known that woman 3 weeks, and I know that. She doesn't go to St. Louis unless she's going to come back with what she went for." She looked at her brother. "The question is, what Leonard does while she's gone." Nate had been asking himself the same thing for 2 days. He kept arriving at the same answer which he didn't like, but which kept presenting itself with the stubborn persistence of things that are true. "He'll go after the ranch directly," he said. "Not the land claim. Something faster. Something that looks legitimate enough that Dempsey can't stop it on sight. How? I don't know yet, but he told me himself Harold Kress is his man, and Harold Kress is the one filing on behalf of the railroad." He stood up. "I need to go to Abilene myself." "Nate, not for long. One day. I need to sit with Frank Alderman face to face and go through those railroad documents and find whatever Harold Kress is hiding in them, because there is something in there, there always is, and I need to find it before Leonard gives Kress the signal to move." He picked up his hat. "Can you and Tom be at the ranch while I'm gone one night?" "You're asking me to house sit." "I'm asking you to be there in case Leonard decides to move while both Dorothy and I are away." Grace looked at him steadily. "You think he'll try something with the ranch empty?" "I think he's a man who takes opportunities, and an empty ranch 6 miles from town is an opportunity." He held her gaze. "I wouldn't ask if I thought—" "I'll be there tonight," Grace said. "Tom can manage without me for a day." She stood. "Go to Abilene. Find what Kress is hiding. Come back before Dorothy gets off that stage, or she'll arrive to an empty house and a locked door and no explanation, and that woman has had enough locked doors used against her to last a lifetime." Nate rode to Abilene that evening and sat with Frank Alderman until past midnight, going through the railroad survey documents line by line, and he found it at 11:40 in a footnote on the back page of a secondary filing, a reference to a boundary adjustment made in July 1873 that cited an authority the document called the Morse Land Commission, which Alderman immediately recognized as a commission that had existed for exactly 4 months before being dissolved for irregularity, and which had been chaired by a man named Calvin Morse. The same Calvin Morse who was the district judge now handling the railroad's claim. Alderman looked at Nate across the desk. "He's been the judge and the commission authority on the same piece of land. Is that enough?" "That's not just enough." Alderman pulled the document toward him. "That's disqualifying. A judge cannot adjudicate a case in which he has a prior undisclosed interest. If I file a judicial misconduct petition tomorrow morning citing this footnote, the Kansas Pacific's claim doesn't just get delayed, it gets referred to a federal review board, and Calvin Morse gets removed from the case." He looked at Nate. "And without Morse, Harold Kress loses his inside track." The case goes back to square one with a clean judge. Nate sat back in his chair and let out a breath he had apparently been holding for approximately 3 years. "File it tomorrow," he said. He rode back to Ridgeline through the early morning dark, arriving at the ranch as the sky was going gray. Grace's horse was in the corral. All the windows were dark and quiet. He put his horse in the barn, came inside, found Grace asleep in the chair by the fire, with her boots still on, and her husband's old rifle across her lap, which was so perfectly Grace that he felt something loosen in his chest. He made coffee. Grace woke up, assessed the situation with the immediate alertness of someone who had always slept with one ear open, and said, "Well, Alderman files the misconduct petition tomorrow morning." Grace exhaled. "Good. Leonard doesn't know yet." "He'll know soon." "Yes." Nate looked at the door, at the road beyond it, at the morning coming up thin and cold over the prairie. "Dorothy's stage comes in this afternoon." "Then go meet it," Grace said. "I'll have supper ready when you get back." He was at the relay station at 3 o'clock when the stage rolled in, same road, same dust, same long Kansas light that made everything look both close and very far away. The door opened, and a drummer got off, and then an older woman, and then Dorothy stepped down with her single bag and her back straight, and her gray eyes finding him immediately across the platform. She walked straight to him. She did not say anything right away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope, thick with papers, and held it out. "Margaret kept everything," she said. "Every document. Every sworn statement Leonard filed. 2 of the witnesses he used, she has signed affidavits from both of them, recanting their testimony. They were Leonard's legal associates, and they lied under oath, and they're willing to say so now because Leonard stopped paying them when he decided they were no longer useful." Her voice was steady and fierce and quiet all at once. "It's enough, Nate. Frank can file on this. This is enough to reopen the custody case." Nate took the envelope. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was the weight of 8 months and 2 weeks and 4 days, and every night Dorothy had pressed a photograph to her chest and refused to give up. "We found something too," he said. "The railroad judge. He chaired the commission that created the boundary dispute he's now ruling on. Alderman filed a misconduct petition this morning." Dorothy stared at him. "The land claim goes to a clean judge. Leonard loses his legal hook." She stood there on the platform with the Kansas wind in her hair and her bag at her feet, and for a moment, just a moment, the careful composure she wore like armor cracked open, and what showed through was not weakness. It was the enormous, exhausted relief of someone who has been fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously and has just watched 2 of the walls hold. Her chin came up. Her jaw was working. She pressed her lips together the way she always did when she was deciding not to break down in front of people. "He's still in Ridgeline," she said. "He is. He'll still fight. He won't go quietly." "I know that." "We need to go to Dempsey. Tonight, with both sets of documents. If Leonard realizes we have this before we can file—" She stopped, picked up her bag. "We need to move fast." Nate took the bag from her hand. She started to object, and he looked at her. Not a look that said, "Let me carry it because you can't," but a look that said, "I'm here, and this is something I can do, and I'd like to do it," and she let him. They walked off the platform together, and Nate thought about what Grace had said, that Dorothy always came back with what she went for, and about how a woman who had been stripped of everything had rebuilt her case from the bottom up, using nothing but the truth and the stubborn refusal to let the truth be buried. And he thought about Leonard Wade at the hotel 2 miles away, sitting with his calculations and his patience and his connections, not yet knowing that the ground had just shifted under every position he'd built, because the woman he'd spent 4 years trying to make small had spent the last 3 weeks becoming something he had never once planned for. She had become someone with people. And that Nate had come to understand was the one thing Leonard Wade had never known how to fight. Dempsey read every document twice the way he read everything, and when he finished he set the stack down on his desk and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The clock on the wall measured out the silence. Dorothy sat straight in the chair across from him, her hands folded watching his face. Nate stood by the window. "The recanting affidavits are the strongest piece," Dempsey said finally. "Two witnesses admitting they committed perjury in a custody proceeding, that's not just grounds for appeal, that's grounds for criminal referral against the witnesses, and against anyone who suborned their testimony." He looked at Dorothy. "That means Leonard." "I know what it means. Do you want to pursue that criminal charges against your ex-husband is a different fight than a custody appeal? It's longer, it's uglier, and Leonard Wade will spend every dollar he has making it personal." "It's already personal," Dorothy said. "It's been personal since he told Bobby I left voluntarily." Dempsey nodded once, moved on. "Frank Alderman's misconduct petition against Judge Morse, has that been officially filed?" "This morning," Nate said. "Alderman sent confirmation by wire at noon. Then we have a narrow window." Dempsey stood, moved to the map on the wall that showed Kansas Territory and its counties, and the rail lines running through them, like stitches in dry leather. "Leonard doesn't know about the Morse petition yet. He doesn't know about the affidavits. He's been here a week operating under the assumption that his legal position is airtight, and that pressure and time will do what they always do for him." He turned. "We file everything simultaneously tomorrow morning. Federal court the custody, appeal the judicial misconduct petition, all of it at once, so he can't block one while we're filing another." "If he finds out tonight," Dorothy started. "He won't," Dempsey said. "Not if we're careful. He has one contact I know of, Cutter, the man who's been asking around town. I've been watching Cutter for a week." He picked up his hat. "I'm going to go have a conversation with Cutter tonight that makes it very clear that Ridgeline's hospitality has a hard outer edge." Dorothy looked at him. "Roy, what does that mean exactly?" "It means I'm going to invite him to spend the night in my jail on a charge of harassment and public disturbance, which I can justify based on 3 separate complaints I've received from townspeople this week, all of which I've been holding until I needed them." Dempsey put on his hat. "Leonard has no information source tomorrow morning. That's all it means." After he left, Dorothy and Nate walked back through the main street of Ridgeline in the early dark, and she was quiet in the particular way she got quiet when she was running calculations, and he let her run them, walking close beside her with her bag in his hand. The hotel was lit up at the far end of the street, warm yellow windows against the black Kansas sky, and without discussing it, they both looked at it as they passed, and then both looked away. "He'll know by noon tomorrow," Dorothy said. "Once the filings are entered into the court record, his lawyers in St. Louis will wire him within hours. By noon tomorrow, it won't matter what he knows. It'll be filed. He won't accept it. He doesn't have to accept it." Nate kept his voice level. "The court doesn't need his acceptance. That's the point of a court." She was quiet another half block. "He came here because he thought I had nothing and nobody. He thought I'd traded one trap for another, Leonard's house for a failing cattle ranch with a stranger." She paused. "He was trying to offer me a way back that looked like a choice. Supervised visits. Bobby by Christmas. Dressed up in reasonable language so I'd think I was choosing it when I was really just surrendering. I know. The thing that he never understood." She stopped walking. They were in front of Helen's restaurant, closed for the night, the window dark. "The thing Leonard has never been able to understand is that I would rather have nothing and be free than have everything and belong to him. He genuinely cannot comprehend that. To him what he offers has value. To him his house, his name, his access, those are things, real things worth having." Her voice was not bitter. It was almost wondering, the way a person sounds when they are still, after all this time, slightly astonished by a particular kind of blindness. "He has never once understood that what he was actually offering me was a cage with good furniture." Nate turned to look at her. The street was empty around them, the wind moving low through the grass at the edge of town. "And now," she looked up at him, Now I have the ranch accounts in order, and a lawyer in Abilene, and a sheriff who knows how to hold a witness overnight on a harassment charge, and a woman across the street who will feed anyone who needs feeding, and your sister who reorganized my kitchen on Tuesday without asking permission, and put everything in a place I actually like better." Something shifted in her face, not the almost smile, the actual one, quiet and real. "And I have you. Who said you weren't going anywhere?" She said it the way she said everything important, simply, directly, without decoration. "That's not nothing, Nate. That's everything." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Let's go home." Morning came hard and fast, the way Kansas mornings did in October, with a cold edge to the air that meant the season had made its decision and was no longer negotiating. Dorothy was up at 4, dressed and at the table, going through the documents one final time, with the lamp burning low and her pen moving in small, precise checks beside each item. Nate made coffee. They did not talk much. There was a particular kind of silence between them now that had nothing anxious in it. The silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms and no longer needed to fill the space. They were in Alderman's temporary office at the county building by 8 o'clock, and Frank Alderman was already there. His satchel open, his pen ready, looking like a man who had been awake since 5 and found that energizing rather than depleting. Grace arrived at 8:15, uninvited, with Tom behind her, because Grace had decided she was part of this, and that was that. "I'm a witness," Grace announced, sitting down. "If anyone needs a witness, I'm available." "Grace," Nate started. "I'm available," she repeated, and opened her coat. And that was the end of that. Alderman filed 3 separate documents at 9 o'clock precisely. The judicial misconduct petition against Calvin Morse went to the federal circuit clerk. The custody appeal citing the recanting affidavits and the pattern of fraudulent testimony went to the Kansas Federal Family Court. And a criminal referral for perjury and subornation of perjury went to the territorial prosecutor's office with the names of Leonard's witnesses, and at the bottom of the referral, the name Leonard Hargrove Wade as the party who had coordinated and financed the false testimony. By 10 o'clock, it was done, entered, official. Beyond Leonard's reach to pull back. Alderman shook Dorothy's hand at the door. "The custody appeal will take time," he said. "Federal family court doesn't move fast, but the criminal referral will move faster. And once Leonard's name is on a perjury referral in a federal proceeding, his legal standing to pursue the custody order becomes significantly compromised. His own lawyers will start advising him to settle." "He doesn't settle," Dorothy said. "He will when settling protects him from criminal exposure." Alderman was matter-of-fact about it. "Self-preservation is a powerful motivator for men like Leonard Wade. He'll fight until the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of losing. We've just changed those numbers substantially." Dorothy nodded. She thanked him. She was very calm, the way she had been calm through most of this. The compressed, focused calm that Nate had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its most disciplined form. It was Dempsey who came to find them at noon. They were at Helen's restaurant, all 4 of them, Nate and Dorothy, Grace and Tom, eating the first meal any of them had eaten that day, when the sheriff came through the door with his hat in his hand and an expression that was not his usual carefully neutral face. It was something else, something that took Nate a moment to identify because he had not seen it on Roy Dempsey's face before. It was satisfaction. "Leonard Wade checked out of the hotel at 11:15, Dempsey said, pulling up a chair. "He and his remaining man, Briggs. Cutter spent the night in my jail as planned, left on the southbound stage. No announcement, no conversation. He paid his bill, picked up his bags, and got on the stage. He set his hat on the table. I watched him go." The table went quiet. Helen appeared with a coffee cup for Dempsey, set it down, and stood with her arms crossed. Dorothy looked at the door of the restaurant, at the street beyond it, at the direction the southbound stage would have gone. She said nothing for a moment. "He knows," she said finally. "His lawyers wired him. He knows about the Morse petition and the criminal referral, And he's calculating that being present in Kansas, while a federal perjury referral with his name on it is moving through the system, is a greater liability than retreating to Missouri and managing it from there. That's my read, Dempsey said. He'll still fight the custody case from St. Louis, through lawyers. He will, Dempsey agreed. But he'll be doing it from a defensive position. That's different from what he's been doing. Dorothy picked up her coffee cup. She held it in both hands, the way she'd held it the first night in this same restaurant, drawing warmth from it, despite the heat of the room. She looked at Nate across the table. He looked back at her. "It's not over," she said. "Bobby isn't home yet." "No," Nate said. "But the road to home just got a lot clearer." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she set down the coffee cup and straightened in her chair and said, "Alderman said the appeal could take 6 months. I want to use that time. I want to file a formal petition for supervised visitation rights in the interim, so Bobby knows I'm fighting, so he has something from me before the appeal resolves." She looked at Dempsey. "Is that possible to file concurrently?" "I'll ask Frank," Dempsey said, and pulled out a small notebook and wrote it down, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing Nate had witnessed in the entire preceding weeks. Roy Dempsey, who had been sheriff of Ridgeline for 12 years, and had never once written anything down in front of a citizen that anyone could recall writing down Dorothy Calhoun's request in his small, careful hand. Grace across the table watched this happen and looked at Nate with the expression that meant she was filing something away permanently. Tom, who had said almost nothing the entire morning, cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said in the slow, deliberate way Tom Blake said everything. "There's a good school in Ridgeline. Miss Everton teaches 1st through 4th grade in the same building she's been in for 8 years. Good woman. Knows her work." He looked at his coffee. "For when the boy comes." Dorothy looked at Tom. He was not a man who said things for effect. He said things because they were true and they needed saying. The simplicity of it, "for when the boy comes," not if, but when, landed somewhere in her chest that she had been keeping carefully guarded for 8 months and 2 weeks and 4 days, and she pressed her lips together hard and nodded once. "Thank you, Tom," she said. Helen put her hand on Dorothy's shoulder briefly, the same firm, quick gesture she'd used in the first week. The gesture that said, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere, and that is all there is to say about it." Then she went back to the kitchen because there were other people to feed, and life did not pause for its most important moments, it just moved through them. They rode home in the late afternoon, Nate and Dorothy, the same road they'd taken the night she arrived, the same flat Kansas prairie on either side, going gold and copper in the October light. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her shoulder against his arm, and neither of them spoke for the first 2 miles, which was their way now. "The accounts need updating," she said at last, "with alderman's fees and the filing costs. I want to run the numbers tonight and see where we are." "Tonight we rest," Nate said. "Nate, Dorothy." He said it the way she said his name when she needed him to stop and hear her. She stopped. "The accounts will be there tomorrow. The legal fight will be there tomorrow. Leonard will still be in St. Louis being Leonard tomorrow. All of that is true, and all of it will be worked on." He kept his eyes on the road. "Tonight we made it through something that could have gone a lot of different ways, and didn't. I'd like to sit on the porch with my wife and watch the stars come out over the prairie and not talk about accounts for approximately 2 hours. She was quiet for a moment. 2 hours is specific. It's a reasonable estimate. Another pause. "And after 2 hours, then you can talk about accounts all you want." She looked at the road ahead, at the last of the light going amber over the grass at the dark line of the horizon, where the sky came down to meet the land. "All right," she said. 2 hours. The ranch came over the rise the same way it always did. Solid, unspectacular real. The cabin, and the barn, and the corral, and the creek, and the cattle moving slow on the far hill. Nate pulled the wagon to a stop, and they sat there for a moment, before climbing down the horses, blowing easy, the evening air carrying the smell of grass and coming cold. It's enough, Dorothy said quietly. It was what she'd said the first night, standing in the yard looking at the fence line. But it sounded different now. It didn't sound like a woman accepting the minimum. It sounded like a woman who had taken the measure of something and found it more than adequate for what she intended to build. Nate unhitched the horses and put them in the corral. Dorothy went inside and came back out with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the rocking chair Frank Delaney had given her. She'd written to him when she heard about it, and he'd brought it by the second week, embarrassed and gruff about it, and it lived on the porch now like it had always been there. Nate sat on the step below her, and they watched the Kansas sky do what the Kansas sky did at the end of the day, which was to go through every shade of fire before giving in to dark. "Tell me about Bobby," Nate said. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, not at her, which somehow made it easier. "He's stubborn," she said. "He gets that from me. He also gets it from his grandfather, but I prefer to claim it for my side." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He laughs at everything. He finds things funny that no one else would find funny. These small, absurd details that most people walk past. And he laughs at them from the stomach the way small children laugh before they learn to be self-conscious about it." She paused. "He's going to be a good person. He already is. Whatever Leonard has told him or done around him these 8 months, Bobby has something in him that is just intact. You can see it in his face, even in the photograph. He's still whole." "He is," Nate said. "I can see it too. You've looked at that photograph a lot." "Some." "You don't have to." She stopped. "You didn't sign up for a child. The advertisement said working partner. The letter said accounting and livestock. There was no fine print about a 5-year-old. Nate turned on the step so he could look at her. She was watching the horizon, her profile sharp against the fading light, the same strong jaw and gray eyes that her son had in miniature in that photograph. "Dorothy," he said, "when Bobby comes, and he is coming, we are going to bring him home. He's going to need a place that feels like a place. Not a temporary arrangement. Not a legal address on a court document. A place." He held her gaze when she turned to look at him. "This is that place. I want it to be that place. And I want you to stop acting like wanting that makes you a burden, because it doesn't. It makes you a mother who loves her son, and that is not a thing I need to be protected from." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. The rocking chair was still. The prairie had gone quiet, the way it went quiet at this hour. The birds settled, the wind dropped the whole enormous flat world holding its breath before the stars. "You are a strange man, Nate Calhoun," she said. "Been told that," he said, "usually by Grace." She's not wrong. Something moved in Dorothy's face, the smile, the real one, full and unguarded, the one that changed the whole architecture of her expression, and that Nate had been cataloging without knowing he was cataloging it since the second night in the kitchen when she'd almost smiled at something he'd said about accounts. "But strange in the best possible way," she said. "The way that turns out to be exactly right." She reached down and put her hand on his shoulder, warm and certain, the hand of a woman who had decided that trust was worth the risk, and had decided it deliberately not, because she had no other choice, but because she had looked at this man and this land and this unlikely cobbled-together life and chosen it with open eyes. He put his hand over hers. They sat like that while the stars came out over Kansas, one by one, the way they always did, unhurried, indifferent to the troubles of the people below them, burning the same as they had burned before. Any of this, and would burn long after, and from 6 miles away. Ridgeline was a faint scatter of lamplight on the dark plain, and somewhere east of here, a man named Leonard Wade was on a stage calculating his next move, and that was real, and it would have to be dealt with, but not tonight, not in this hour. In the spring, the letter from Frank Alderman arrived on a Tuesday, which Dorothy always said afterward was fitting because all the important things in her life seemed to happen on Tuesdays. She read it at the kitchen table with Nate across from her and her coffee going cold, and when she finished, she set it down flat on the wood and covered it with both hands and closed her eyes. The federal court had ruled. The custody appeal had been granted. The original order was vacated on the grounds of fraudulent testimony. Leonard Wade had entered into a negotiated settlement with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office, which meant no criminal trial and no prison, but which required him to relinquish full custody pay, Dorothy's legal costs, and submit to a permanent injunction, barring him from initiating any further legal action against her or her household. His lawyers had advised him in the end exactly as Alderman had predicted. The cost of fighting had exceeded the cost of losing. Bobby would arrive on the Thursday stage. Dorothy sat at the table with her hands over the letter and her eyes closed and did not speak. Nate waited. The clock measured out the silence. Outside, the April wind moved through the new grass, and the cattle were making their morning sounds in the pasture, and a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in Kansas spring, which is to make the world sound like it was specifically designed for this moment. "He's coming home," Dorothy said. Her voice was very quiet, not fragile, quiet the way something becomes quiet when it has been under enormous pressure for a very long time, and the pressure finally releases. "He's coming home," Nate said. She opened her eyes. She looked at the letter. She looked at Nate. And then Dorothy Calhoun, who had kept herself together through 8 months of loss and 12 months of fighting, and every day of the long, hard work of building something real out of nothing, put her face in her hands and wept. Not the careful, controlled grief of a woman who had learned to cry without making a sound. Not the muffled, private crying of someone who had been taught that falling apart was a liability. She wept the way people weep when the thing they fought for actually comes true fully, without apology, with her shoulders shaking and her breath coming in ragged waves, all the compressed weight of 2 years releasing itself at once, because there was finally room for it. Nate moved his chair around the table and sat beside her, and put his arm around her and held her. And he did not tell her it was all right because it was better than all right. And he did not tell her to stop because she had earned every one of those tears, and he did not say anything at all because some moments are larger than words, and the only thing to do with them is stay. When it passed, she straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She took a breath. She looked at the letter one more time at the court seal and the official language, and Bobby's name printed there in black ink, like a fact the world was finally agreeing to. "We need to get him a bed," she said. "A proper one. The bunk in the back room needs a new mattress. I'll go to town today. And I should write to Miss Everton at the school. Tom said she was good." "She is. He'll need—" She stopped. She looked at Nate, and something in her expression was still raw from the weeping, but underneath it was something else entirely. Something that had been building since the first morning she'd made biscuits in his kitchen and rolled up her sleeves and decided this was the place she was going to stand. "He'll need to see that this is home," she said. "Not a temporary place, not a waiting room, home." "Then we'll make sure he sees that," Nate said. "First thing." She nodded. She stood up. She picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in the tin box on the shelf where she kept the documents that mattered beside the marriage certificate and the ranch's land patent and Bobby's photograph that no longer needed to travel in her dress pocket, because this was the place it lived. Now. This was the mantle it sat on. This was home. She looked at Nate standing in the kitchen of the ranch they had built together out of accounts and fence posts and legal filings, and 2 years of showing up for each other in the way that mattered, which was not grand and was not easy, and was better than either. 2 days, she said. "He comes in 2 days." 2 days, Nate agreed. And Dorothy Wade Calhoun, who had arrived in Ridgeline with empty arms and a mother's rage, and nothing else, walked out onto the porch of the ranch that was hers, and looked at the Kansas spring morning, and understood with the full certainty of a woman who had fought her way to the truth that the most powerful thing she had ever done was not the confrontation in the sheriff's office, or the trip to St. Louis, or the documents she had assembled with such fierce precision. It was the moment she had stepped off a stage in the dark, and told a stranger the truth about what she needed and trusted, against every instinct her life had built in her, that he would not use it against her. She had been right. And because she had been right, a little boy with her gray eyes and a gap-toothed grin was on a train right now, heading home to a mother who had never stopped fighting a man who had made room for him before they'd ever met, and a life that had been built piece by careful piece out of the refuse of everything Leonard Wade had tried to take proof, if proof were needed, that what a cruel man destroys a brave woman can build again, and what she builds the second time she builds to last.